Canada has just announced new measures to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. The support includes a major sanctions package and an additional $2 billion in new military support to the country. Prime Minister Mark Carney made the announcement as he met Ukraine's president at the G7 summit in Kananaskis. And the timing for the support is crucial. Overnight, Russia launched more missiles and drone strikes on Kyiv. It's believed to be the deadliest attack on the capital this year. With that, I want to bring in the CBC's Janice McGregor, who is part of our news team covering the summit, and she joins us now live from Banff, Alberta. Janice, what more details do we know about this support that was announced for Ukraine as those two leaders continue their bilateral talks?
Yeah, a really interesting intersection of geopolitics and security strategy with also some domestic politics thrown in. I'll explain. Mark Carney has laid out a multifaceted sort of plan here for boosting Canada's support to Ukraine. Let's hear a clip of what he announced as his bilateral talks with Volodymyr Zelensky began today, and then we'll unpack it a bit.
Canada is announcing today several measures, sanctions, first and foremost, against a number of individuals in Russia, against over 40 entities in Russia and beyond that are trying to contribute to the evasion of sanctions, the sanctioning of over 200 vessels in the shadow fleet that Russia is using, again, to try to evade these sanctions. That's the first thing. The second is we are providing additional military assistance, drones, helicopters, broader munitions, over $2 billion worth of assistance directly to Ukraine. And thirdly, we are dispersing the next tranche of the loan based on the frozen Russian assets, over $2 billion as well.
So let's take each of these things in turn. First, on the sanctions. This is something Canada appears to be doing in conjunction with other allies. I note elsewhere in coverage that the British government also kind of around the same time today has come out with sanctions again on the shadow fleet. If people haven't heard that term before, it's a reference to the fact that in an effort to avoid international sanctions on, for example, oil exports, energy exports out of Russia, they have these shipping vessels that kind of skirt it and get the oil out anyway because of sort of how they're owned and flagged. These are sanctions against those entities as well as other individuals. Canada by now has a long list of individuals that it has targeted for economic measures. Not always people who have been in Canada or wanting to come to Canada or who have assets here in Canada, but part of the reason why Canada puts these individuals on their list alongside other allies is to make sure that they can't simply move things from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and dodge one country's sanctions, one ally's sanctions, by moving off to another Western democracy. And then we have sort of the piece of this that you heard Mark Carney talking about that is about procurement, this additional kind of amount of money that, yes, counts towards the increased spending push by the Canadian government to eventually reach that 2% of GDP NATO targets that they are going to do in this fiscal year, if you remember the government's announcement from last week. What will this include? We are waiting for more details from Global Affairs with some precision on this, but you heard mentioned there things like drones, ammunition, obviously big parts of the conflict in Ukraine. Also helicopters, which we're trying to figure out what that might mean, where they'd be purchased from. Light armored vehicles also, of course, General Dynamics has that facility in London, Ontario. That would mean jobs there. Anything built in Canada would not only create jobs, but use steel and aluminum. And here's where we get into kind of the moment where the federal government is wanting to make smart decisions in terms of sort of what it might be doing on defense procurement, on security strategy, that also helps bolster its own economy, which in and of itself is a defensive move against Donald Trump's tariff threats. So when we have the granular details on that, I personally will be looking to see whether some of these things are things that use a lot of Canadian steel and aluminum. Finally, the third piece of this is financing for Volodymyr Zelensky's government. Mark Carney, they are talking about how that this would be dispersed based on frozen Russian assets in Canada. Now, The Russian central bank at the time of this conflict and the beginning of the sanctions against it had $19-20 billion worth of its central bank assets held by Canadian financial institutions. Those have been frozen, as well as smaller amounts of assets held by other prominent oligarchs like Roman Abramovich. And then, of course, we had that plane sitting on the tarmac at Pearson Airport, which they've only now gone to court to finally seize and perhaps turn the proceeds over to Ukraine. So this new loan appears to be backed by the central bank assets, if I'm understanding them correctly, that are being held here in Canada. But very important for Volodymyr Zelensky to receive the support of other countries that sort of have the credit to offer Ukraine in its time of need as it tries to keep the lights on through what has turned out to be a very long war. And to win that, you need allies. Let's hear from Volodymyr Zelensky sitting beside Mark Carney as this support was announced.
Thank you for your very important words, warm words, and supporting Ukraine. Of course, condolences to our families. Really, our families had a very difficult night. One of the biggest attacks from the very beginning of this war, 440 Shaheeds, Iranian drones, and 32 missiles, including ballistic. And I was on direct connection during the flight with all the ministers and of course with the chief of air defense. And really, it was a big attack on civilian infrastructure, on people, just people.
So an extraordinary setting for his meeting with G7 leaders around the table, not around the table Donald Trump, having left the summit for other reasons last evening. Is it easier for the people who remain to come up with a strong joint statement on Ukraine without Donald Trump? One would think most certainly. Would it have been stronger if Donald Trump was part of the conversation and on board? Yes. Could he have been, though? Remember those comments yesterday about how he thinks that Russia should be part of this gathering, and he thinks that that was offensive to Vladimir Putin, and bragging that he's the one that talks to Putin. Very difficult between allies right now, but trying to do what they can today to bolster President Zelensky after a punishing night.
And Janice, of course, we know that this is all part, when we're talking about the support for Ukraine from Canada, it's part of that increase in defense spending that you touched on. And that is, of course, trying to meet the target, rather, that has been set out by NATO. We know that NATO's Secretary General is also at the summit and met with Canada's Prime Minister also today. What did we hear from them?
That's right. And in a way, this move today is laying track for another important summit at the end of the month between the partners of the NATO alliance, where they will be talking about whether they need to reach an even higher target as a percentage of each country, each member of the alliance is GDP spending. Nevertheless, Mark Rutte today, in meeting with Carney bilaterally, pleased to see these moves by Canada to increase the military spending. Here is NATO's Secretary General.
The fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic. And with Portugal having announced the 2% this year last week, that means that the whole of NATO will now be in 2025 at 2% before the summit starts next week in The Hague. So that is really great news. And your leadership here has been extremely important.
One final political note, this additional defense spending, the details of which we're getting today, is going to be up for votes tonight. I misspoke last hour. Tonight in the House of Commons, when MPs vote on the supplementary estimates. How extraordinary, though, that the details of exactly what they're approving are coming out here at the summit with just hours before the votes. We will see if there's any reaction in Ottawa on that front.
Thanks for the latest on this. That is the CBC's Janice McGregor reporting from Banff, Alberta.